Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at CPA Academy. This is Maureen Dudley, and I will be your moderator on today's webinar, Diversity and Inclusion One-on-One, Leading the Charge. And it's going to be a great discussion today between Julius and Jina, and I'll be introducing them in just a minute, but we're so grateful that you are here with us. Before we do get started, I do want to make sure that this is working for all of you. So let's do a few quick technical checks. If you could please go over to the Q&A section of your GoToWebinar panel there, please go over and let us know, yes, I can hear you, and yes, I can see the first slide up on the screen. If you are having trouble hearing or seeing throughout the webinar, please know that is what I am here for. I will do my best to send you some troubleshooting tips so you can let us know that you can see, so you can let us know that you can hear. But while we wait for that, let me see, because sometimes on a webcast it takes a little bit longer for results to come in. There we go. People are starting to say, yes, I can see, yes, I can hear. Wonderful. They're flooding in now. Texas, Palm Beach. Oh, even from Jerusalem. All systems are go. We can see and hear. Great. Thank you, everyone, for letting us know. Now, as far as the housekeeping for your CPE credit, this session qualifies for 1 credit of CPE. And in order to earn that credit, please remain logged in for at least 50, that's 50 minutes, and answer all our polling questions. Today we have 5 polling questions. Only 3 are required for credit, but we do encourage you to answer all 5 of them. We here at CPA Academy will then process your credit by the end of the day, and that will be made available in your account within approximately 24 hours, along with an archived recording of this webinar and a copy of the handouts. Speaking of handouts, you can also find those in your GoToWebinar handout panel. But don't worry if you have any problems downloading those will be available in your CPA Academy account. Well, I think that is plenty of housekeeping. I'm going to step out of the way and turn today's webinar over to Jina Etienne and Julius Green. Welcome, Jina and Julius, excuse me.
Thank you. Thank you, Maureen. And thank you, everyone, for joining today. So before we jump in, of course, I have to introduce our illustrious speaker, Julius Green. We've known each other for years now, and I enjoy talking with Julius because I learn something new every time. So a little bit about Julius. You served in the Air Force, yes, so thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Your time in public accounting goes back several years. I know 18 years with Baker Tilly, and now you're retired. And Julius is serving on several boards now. You're a business fellow at the Villanova School of Business, where you're helping the accounting department with their DEI strategy. But you know, your work with D&I goes a lot farther than that. Julius was the past chair of the Pennsylvania Institute of CPAs, and as well as the past chair of their diversity committee, and you still serve on that diversity committee, as well as serving on the PICPA Foundation, and that foundation does focus on diversity and inclusion across the profession, but also on the pipeline. And you were past chair of the foundation. So that's your bio. I'm so grateful you're here. Thank you for joining us, Julius.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited about it.
So before we jump into the conversation, I wanted to sort of just frame it. This is a great article. It does speak to diversity in leadership, but I thought that the points that they brought up were great. And, you know, you and I have talked about this before, but maybe this will set the stage. This talks about diversity at the leadership level. Today, we're going to talk about the importance of leadership leading the charge. But we know diverse leadership isn't necessarily as diverse. I mean, I know, particularly in CPA firms, we don't see a lot of partners that look like you and I. And you might even speak to that as your experience in a larger firm. And we also know that at the top, when we talk about leading the charge, a lot of firms, when they start diversity or organizations, they either started in the middle, so not at the leadership level. And by the middle, I mean, let's look at our manager pipeline and think who we can bring up the ranks to partner. How can we get that pipeline to partner more diverse? Or they might even look at it prospectively, as in diversifying the recruiting. So that's another area. So these are the 6 recommendations. These are the steps that they talk about. A couple that relate to our conversation is stakeholder buy-in. And The other ones are bringing in the experts. And what I'll say about that is what we've noticed, particularly this last year, is a trend in corporations and firms to look at the minorities themselves. Let's look at the people of color, the women, and people with disabilities, and ask them to do the training, as opposed to bringing in an expert. But that's like asking me to train somebody in the majority about how to make me feel more included. It can be uncomfortable, and it's a lot of pressure. Leading the shift in company culture, people behave the way you behave, and for the behaviors you find acceptable as the leader. So it's all about what the tone, the example you set. So those are just a couple of things. Oh, and the last one here about providing diversity support resources. That's really about all of us. That's not just support for the minorities in the profession, in the firm or in the company. It's for everyone. Education, as well as empowerment, permission to talk about these things. You know, a lot of conversations about uncomfortable conversations and implicit bias. So I just wanted to lay some of these out there as we jump into our conversation. And maybe we start with the point that they were making about leadership buy-in.
Well, thank you for setting the stage for the conversation. Obviously, it's important to have buy-in at the top of the organization, and in particular, as you mentioned, my experience has been largely with public accounting firms. But before I answer the question and sort of get into that specific topic, I feel obliged to sort of set a bit of a disclaimer. I don't consider myself a traditional DEI expert. I've not studied DE&I from an academic perspective, or worked as a chief diversity officer or human resource expert. And as you described my bio, my perspective is almost entirely from a practical experience. Having been the only minority, the only Black, the only throughout my entire career, and I know you've had a similar experience. In both higher education, where I spent 12 years, as well as public accounting, where I've spent the last 25 years of my career prior to retiring. And so, as my career progressed, part of my responsibility, in addition to my day job, was some aspect of DEI. Largely because there was a need there, and it was my passion. And so, I have and will want to continue to really be a resource for both companies and in their leadership, as well as young professionals of color, to enhance their DEI efforts. So I just wanted to indicate, for the audience, that a lot of my experience really comes from a practical approach. And what I've seen in that vein is that, particularly in more recent years, there's been a little bit of external pressure for organizations to really do something about their DEI efforts, for a whole host of reasons that we'll get into. And typically the leadership will offer up some aspect of DEI. And we've certainly seen a lot of that in light of the George Floyd and last summer's racial unrest. And the question becomes, how much of that sort of trickles down or is forced down through the rest of the organization? Leadership can come in a lot of different forms. Obviously, at the top of the organization, but there also needs to be leadership throughout the organization to make a real DEI effort meaningful and transformative, if you will.
So transformative, I think we talked about, there was some language you used as transformational change versus transactional change. Can you talk about that?
Sure. As I got into this area of DEI and started really focusing some of my efforts in this space over the last 15 to 20 years, my thought was we ought to be able to, rowing in the same direction, make some transformational change in this space. And I think over my time in working in this space, I've sort of changed my point of view relative to that. I think it's very difficult DEI is difficult in and of itself. It's a really tough area to really make strong and meaningful and long-lasting impact in. And so I think the thought of transformational change is a bit naive. I think transactional change is what I've started working with organizations on and really trying to focus on. And I don't think that's a cop-out. I think for a whole host of reasons, it's difficult to have transformational change right now. I think demographically, I think we're probably 15 to 20 years away from real transformational change. And I know you and I have discussed that over the last couple of years. But I think transactional change, meaningful transactional change, can move an organization in a very meaningful way as well. And let me explain what I mean by that. I think in my mind, I view a continuum of doing nothing as a 0 on a scale of 1 to 10, and transformational being at the 10 level. And I think everything in between is transactional, right? And so you can have a movement of, moving an organization from a 2 to a 6 on that scale as being transactional, but it can be meaningful for both the organization and the rank and file employees that work within that organization.
So this is a perfect time, actually. Maureen, maybe we can launch that first polling question, which is has to do with that scale of 1 to 10 that you just mentioned.
Perfect. I was just thinking it's about time for a poll.
So
it says, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you place your organization's DEI efforts? If people go ahead and answer that, we have about 60 seconds, but were you going to go ahead and maybe take a question or two while the poll's open, Jina?
Well, what I was going to mention is, Julius, just so you know, I thought this was interesting. Our video disappears while the polling questions, so nothing's broken. And to invite our participants, please put questions in as we go along. We might ask them as we go, but we also are going to hold some time at the end for Q&A.
And just as a reminder for people throwing in questions today, please make sure all your comments are professional. I've seen a couple come in that maybe aren't as professional as we would like. So we're going to go ahead and leave this open for another 5 or 6 seconds. We'd like to get about 95% of you voting, or leave it open for about 1 minute. So we're going to count it down. If you need your CPE, please get your vote in. I'm counting it down now in 3, 2, 1.
So let's see those results. This is going to be interesting.
There you go. Yes, there they are.
I know I have to find them on my side. Let's see.
Oh, would you like me to, there's 0 to 3 are at 17%, 4 to 6 are 25, 7 to 9, 28, 10 or 10%, and 19% of respondents aren't sure.
So that's interesting. Very interesting. Thank you. So I figured out how to open it. So it looks like it's an even split, Julius, when you were talking about on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 or 0 being not really doing much, to a 10 is transformational change. Can I ask you, Julius, where between the 1 and the 10 would you say how much of this is transactional? Because is that up to like a 6 or 7? Or is that really 1 and 2 on a scale of 1 to 10?
Yeah, I think you can argue that transactional can take you all the way up into the 6, 7 range. I find this poll interesting, though, because it's different than what I would have expected to see. I think if it largely, and you and I talked about an article, I think that you forwarded to me at one point, that it oftentimes depends on where you sit within the organization as to where you believe the organization is on that scale, whether you're rank and file versus a leader within the organization. Leaders tend to view the organization as doing better than the rank and file in this space. Minorities tend to think that the organization is not doing as well as the majority tends to think. And so I found that interesting and a little bit surprising that, as many individuals feel that they're in that 7 to 10 range as we saw. And that's encouraging.
Oh, yeah, I would say so. And I think one of the articles we had talked about over the summer, there was, it talks about how you perceive that shift. And that if you are diverse, a diverse person, and let me be clear, when we say diverse person in this context, we're talking about, for the sake of simple language, white. Versus when we say diverse, you're usually a person of color. But the other side of that isn't just race. Diverse is also a person with a disability, or who is disabled is actually the right way to say that. A member of our LGBTQ community. So there are other types of differences. And when you are somebody that is different than the group, possibly the only in the room, you will measure the tipping point of change at a different spot than if you're of the majority. And what we found, what the data shows, is those who are of the majority think we're achieving success at a point sooner than those of us in the minority. So just to the point that you were speaking to earlier, it's interesting because how you measure change now means that if the definitions are different and the tipping points are different, then how do we know we're making progress?
No, it's a great point, and I think it's one of those areas where you don't really know what kind of progress you're making unless you measure it, right? And unless you have metrics in place, which I've found a lot of organizations reluctant to do in this space, in the DEI space. But having some way of measuring year to year, or every periodically, how the organization feels, how, sort of a cultural measurement to a large extent. You can also measure it obviously in terms of pure numbers, but I think most organizations that are measuring the impact and the directional impact of diversity are really looking at of cultural changes and measuring how individuals feel within the organization from period to period. But as I mentioned, it's a difficult space not only to navigate in terms of moving throughout that continuum, but also determining, to your question, how well the organization is doing.
So we had talked about the notion of keeping up with the Joneses. And by that, I mean, you've been talking about leadership in the organization and what that change looks like. But is there pressure, or are you starting to see pressure at the executive level to start to drive meaningful change, even if it's transactional, because your peer companies are doing it? Is that happening yet?
Well, I think there's some pressure on, and I'll speak to public accounting firms. I think for companies in general, the George Floyd last summer, the summer of 2020, was a game changer in many respects for most organizations. You saw a flurry of organizations looking to make a statement about their support for largely people of color and diversity efforts. Many of those turned into what I'll call more meaningful dialogue around diversity, rather than just something on the website that articulates the company's support. And so that was one sort of pressure point, if you will.
Right.
And I think the question that many people have is whether that was a moment or a movement, whether that's going to be sustainable over a longer period of time. You've also had some of the Big Four firms who have started to hear from their clients and board members that they needed to see more diversity within those organizations. And so I think there's been some external pressure. Clearly, there's been internal pressure from employees who, like you and I, have been in these organizations for some period of time, or even some of the newer employees who have, I'll say demanded and certainly insisted on having a meaningful effort around diversity and inclusion within the organization. But I will tell you that again, the polling that we saw just a minute ago surprised me a bit, because my anecdotal experience is that most organizations aren't poised to be in that 7 to 10 range on that scale, because there hasn't been enough of the boards that have been and clients that have been insisting on seeing more diversity within the organization's leadership. You know, a lot of the data that we see indicates that the changing demographics, while they're changing as we speak, you know, sort of the tipping point, as you described, of having, you know, minorities as the majority. I think most of the data you see is 2030, 2040. And so the question is, how much of a pressure point is that putting on firms at this particular time as we sit here in 2021? My suspicion is not as much as it will in 10 years.
So, you know, we have a polling question on that. We've actually had a couple of questions come in that speak to this, the shifting the demographics. So maybe we can open, Maureen, the second poll so we can see the thinking on that.
Okay, I'm launching that right now. Where do you believe the most dramatic impact to improve diversity will come from?
While that's there, Maureen, can you tell me on the back end on the panel, there's green and red flags?
Yes. Basically, if it's just a comment, sometimes I'll flag it in green for you, but if it's a question that you might want to address, I usually flag it in orange, just to make it a little helpful for you to see them.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay.
And while the poll is open, one of the things that came up, Julius, is when we talk about 15 to 20 years before seeing transformational change, does this have to do with the changing demographic in the US? And I would ask you to answer that question, but let's see their polling results first, because I want to see what other people think.
I'm going to leave it open for about just another 10 seconds because we want to make sure we give people a full minute to answer. Remember, you need to have these polling questions in order to get your credit. I'll go ahead and count us down now in 3, 2, 1, and then let me share. Can you see those results?
We can. So Julie, so you're seeing that 22% think it's got to do with the demographic changes, 38% leadership from the top. The rest is sort of a mix in between, other than the 13% who aren't sure.
Yeah. No, and this particular result doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, you asked the question about how impactful will demographics have on meaningful change, and I would say it's everything. And the changing demographics will help drive the business case, in my view, that will put the type of pressure on the leadership at the top of the organization to focus and to have sustained efforts around DEI. And so I think those are congruent thoughts, if you will.
I want to make a quick note. A couple of questions have come in about the slides. This isn't intended to be a presentation. This is really a discussion. So there aren't any other slides here. We do have one resource that we'll share with you at the end. But I just wanted to make that clear. And then if I can ask you from a demographics perspective, you know, we've talked about this. If you look at the generations that are in the workforce today, the largest generation is millennial. We know millennials see diversity a little bit more holistically. They look at it from an intersectionality perspective, see me as more than female or Black or deaf, whatever the case may be. Whereas Gen Xers and baby boomers tend to see it along underrepresented groups, equal opportunity. And so is what you're saying demographic shift? Does that mean 10 years from now, 15 years from now, millennials will be in the C-suite as a passage of time? And so diversity will happen because of the passage of time? Or is it 15 years for the work we're doing to drive change?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of those things. I think key to that, though, is, as you described, the Generation Z and the millennials being now in those C-suite positions and making those decisions around who are assets, if you will, that are value to the organization and see value in a different way than historically baby boomers have. They'll be free of the historical biases that we've sort of grown up with. I think they have, generally speaking, Generation Z and millennials have grown up in more of a comfort level with differences and people that look different and are different than them. And so I think the combination of their being in those leadership roles and the what I'll call the other pressures that we described earlier, having not only more individuals in the pipeline that are different and diverse, but also, as I mentioned earlier, having that external force of diverse individuals sitting on boards demanding that organizations have a better offering of diversity when they come to the table. I think all of those things will factor into it.
And I will say thank you to some of our participants. There are a couple of comments, so this is an opportunity to clarify that when we're talking about diverse groups, LGBTQ plus is definitely part of that group. Someone asked about American Indian or Native American, and yes, I apologize, I didn't list them all, and I probably will forget a few more, but we're speaking to all the groups. And the group will vary depending on the organization you're with. So you're wearing a National Association of Black Accountants shirt there. Proudly,
I am
thank you. Proudly. I mean, I was the CEO at NABA for 2 years. And when we were at NABA events, we were the majority. And so there might have been people who were white, Asian, Latinx, attending those events, but the events were predominantly Black. And so in that context, we, the majority group, have to be thoughtful about how to make the minority group feel comfortable. But we're talking in the corporate world, it's usually the other way around. And so how do we, is that a question of measurement? You used the word measurement earlier. You talked about data. Should organizations do the math? Should they add up the number of people they have in these different groups? And if you do that, is there a worry that we'll head toward tokenism?
Yeah, and I think that's been part of the concern that organizations have had in terms of counting, if you will, not only tokenism, but the old affirmative action and sort of quotas that have become bad words over the last 20, 30 years. I sort of go back and forth on whether counting is the most effective way of measuring success. I think it could be one of the measures. But I think organizations need to be thoughtful about their approach to diversity and inclusion, equity and inclusion. And in doing that, I think they'll arrive at the right measures to move the organization forward or to determine how effective the organization is moving forward. And let me just to your earlier comment on some of the chat conversation you had. I will oftentimes speak of, when I speak of diversity and inclusion, I will speak oftentimes of people of color. And one of the reasons is that that's the space that I've operated mostly in, but that's also the space that a lot of organizations have started with regard to their diversity and inclusion efforts, largely because after you address the women's initiatives, the next logical place, just from a pure number standpoint, is people of color. And a lot of the issues and challenges of getting more people of color also resonate with LGBTQ communities and other marginalized communities as well. So I'll just say we're all in it together, and I apologize both after the fact and in advance if I shorthand that.
There's an acronym, BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And that's often used to speak broadly about people of color. And you talked about gender. I know in the accounting profession, the initiatives around gender have been going on for 20 plus years or so. And we're starting to see change. When we look at the partnership group For example, in public accounting, 77% of those partners are male, which means, wait, in my CPA, how do you do math? Was that 23% are female?
Yes.
And trending differently, because we know at the manager level, it's almost 50-50. So maybe that's a question to your earlier point about the passage of time. Although we see women dropping out of the partner pipeline for a number of reasons, we're seeing progress. And so can those same strategies we used be used for our other groups then? What we did to move the gender needle?
Yeah, I think there's some similarities to strategies and some real differences as well. And I know a lot of organizations like Baker Tilly, where I spent a good portion of my career, are looking at those as combined efforts, but having them on slightly separate tracks for some of the differences that I mentioned. You know, clearly you mentioned the numbers. Purely from a number standpoint, there are more women that are coming into and have been coming into public accounting as many as men over the last, I don't know, 10 years or so. And so it was always easier to find those resources, and the challenges were different. It wasn't a matter of recruiting them because we had those available to recruit. The pipeline was there. The question became more, as you said, once they got to manager, then there were challenges, right? And a lot of those had to do with glass ceiling issues that firms have been trying to address. And so that's where some of the differences between pure numbers of, you know, BIPOCs, as you describe them, and women initiatives, that's where the differences come in. But the similarities are mindset, right? Trying to change the mindset of the organization as to the importance of diversity and the value that diversity brings in terms of the thinking of the organization and how they go to business. So sort of the business case around diversity is very similar between women's initiatives and some of the other initiatives that we're discussing as well.
So if we take this back to the challenge of leadership, because so often when we talk about tone in the top, it's those of us who aren't at the top looking up at the top. But does it feel differently at the top? Because there is a concern and a question. Let me just almost read it word for word. Do you feel there's a growing number of companies that are using the topic of diversity and inclusion as the check the box item in order to compete in the marketplace? And how can one decipher if the movement is genuine or not? And I bring that up because leaders, they are accountable to their board of directors, or they are accountable to whoever's measuring their performance. So how do we know they're not doing this as that check the box exercise in this question, and that it's genuine from an organizational perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's difficult. I think a lot of organizations are checking the box, and candidly have been checking the box for a lot of years on this topic. And I think the way in which they're held accountable are some of the external and internal forces and efforts that I mentioned earlier. You know, having internally, having individuals at the grassroots level, mid-management level, you know, continuing to emphasize how important it is to them. Our younger team members in some of these organizations, firms, and the like have an increasing amount of power in ways that we never had, Jina, as younger professionals. And again, it's purely based on numbers. It is a seller's market right now. Public accounting firms and other organizations are looking for great talent in ways that it was readily available to them 15 or 20 years ago. And so you have a voice. Organizations are listening to their younger team members. And so I wouldn't undersell the importance of that. At the same time, it is for many organizations, and I'll say this, not letting CEOs and leadership members off the hook, because I think we need to continue to put pressure on them to move this effort in the right way and at the right pace. But if you think about it, and you mentioned it, Jina, organizations have competing voices, competing stakeholders, competing interests and activities that drive the organization. And so if you think about being a CEO or managing partner of a large firm, there are strategic priorities that are driving them to help the firm succeed. And you have to ask yourself, if you're the managing partner of a large public accounting firm, would diversity, equity, and inclusion be within your top 10 list? And I've asked myself that question a number of times. I've served as one of the board members of my former firm. And it's a tough question to answer because there are so many other meaningful things in which the organization has to engage in to ensure that all of their stakeholders, including their employees, are well fed and taken care of. My own personal view is that it ought to make its way there, but that's not always the case.
So one, I just want to make a comment because somebody asked a question about whether or not we threw the baby boomers under the bus there. And I'm a Gen Xer. And I don't know what generation you're in. So I won't throw that out there, Julius, but that was not intended to throw anybody under the bus. I think that we know that that generations see diversity differently. And if we don't acknowledge those differences, then the strategies that we're trying to work on might fall flat because one initiative won't serve all the people in the organization. And I think that's important to remember.
Let me speak to that. I am a baby boomer. But I do believe that when we talk about some of these issues, we're talking what I'll call in large generalities, right? So I think 80% of what I've said relative to baby boomers and other issues that we've discussed on this call are, in my view, accurate. And so I don't believe we're throwing baby boomers under the bus. I do believe, as Jina indicated, that we need to be candid and honest about where some of the challenges lie if we expect to move the needle on some of this. And it's just, in my view, largely true that the baby boomer generation viewed diversity and inclusion in a way that wasn't helpful to our moving the issues forward in a way that I think it will be more meaningful in the next generation or two.
Can we go back to the point you just made about priorities? Because data is increasingly showing us there is a correlation between increased diversity, particularly at the leadership level, but certainly across organizations, that actually improves the bottom line. Wouldn't that shift it then? There's a McKinsey study that came out in 2015 that is still widely referenced today that says that when women make up 22% or more of the leadership, that you see a difference in profits, bottom line performance. And organizations that have improved racial and gender diversity in leadership together, the results are better. And it's not causation, but can that kind of correlation influence leaders' decision to actually make this a priority? Because now we're talking about a connection to the bottom line.
It should. It should. So let me mention that you mentioned earlier that I was chair of the PICPA Diversity Committee and the chair of PICPA for some time, for a year. During that time, we developed a number of different tools, and I think you'll have a slide that as we offer some resources to the audience later around PICPA's diversity initiatives. But one of the things that we did was to research and develop a white paper on diversity and inclusion and built what we believe to be a really strong business case as to why organizations ought to be looking to improve their diversity efforts. And a lot of what you just described, a lot of the data, a lot of the research, a lot of the studies point to the business case on diversity and inclusion. And I can tell you that some of the feedback that we got from some that weren't inspired by what we put out there were offsetting studies that showed different data points and in a way that wasn't helpful. And so my point is that, yeah, there are a lot of studies out there that support the business case, and I think they're important studies, and hopefully leaders and organizations will read and use those as a basis for moving forward. And I honestly believe that many of them will, particularly moving forward as more pressures are mounted. But I'd be not an honest broker if I thought that all organizations or most organizations would use those in a meaningful way.
You know, that's fair. And to the point you just made, what that business imperative looks like and what those numbers look like varies between industries. So for example, we know the tech industry has a very different type of diversity problem than, say, public accounting. Diversity in education is different than diversity in the government sector. And so it's important to understand this context within the industry that you're working in. We're both CPAs, and a lot of the people attending and joining us today are in the accounting industry, but not everyone. And so I would encourage all of our attendees to dig a little deeper in how what we're talking about impacts your industry, and particularly your organization, because the one thing we know for sure is this is not a one-size-fits-all problem or solution.
No question.
So if I come back to the Q&A, because I'm loving some of these comments.
Just while you're looking at that for a minute, just as a reminder, we do have 3 more polls to launch in the next 18 minutes.
You want to launch one? Let's go with number 4, about optimism.
So given the past year?
The one about optimism, yeah, given all that has transpired. Yep.
Okay, got it.
Because this is going to be an interesting one. And please, we ask you to check how you feel right now, not necessarily what you think we are saying, if that makes any sense. And Julius, you've used this phrase a couple of times. You said that was in a way that wasn't helpful. Can you explain what you mean by that? Because I heard it as maybe it wasn't trying to move my agenda forward, but I don't think you meant it in terms of any particular group's agenda so much as the broader strategy. Can you clarify?
Yeah, and I don't recall exactly the context that you're describing, but generally, I believe when I've used that phrase, it is helpful to moving the efforts along that continuum that we described before. Does that make sense?
It does. It absolutely does. I'm looking at the Q&A while the poll is open. I don't know how much more time we have, Maureen, on that.
We can go ahead and close it if you're ready. I'm going to go ahead and close this in 3, 2, 1. Would you like me to share those results?
That would be great.
There you go.
So interesting. Almost half, Julius, think it's going to take longer than 24 months, but they didn't go into the probably not for 5 years or more. The majority look at it as between 12 to 24 months for, they're optimistic, I think, that we're going to see progress. Does that surprise you?
No, and hopefully our comments haven't swayed the audience in that regard. But I do think, for the reasons that we talked about earlier, that we are heading in the direction of greater diversity. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen over time. I think people, particularly and largely people in our audience, want to be optimistic as we do about the pace and the direction of that. I think most of us want to believe that we have arrived in a new space on the other side of this pandemic, or as I like to describe them, the twin pandemics that we've been suffering through over the last couple of years, with COVID and the racial unrest. And so it doesn't surprise me that people are looking to be optimistic and wanting to be optimistic about how quickly we move in that space.
So I'm looking at time. We said we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A. So maybe I can just start throwing some of these questions at you.
Sure.
So the first one.
We'll also have some polling questions left as well from Maureen.
Oh yeah, Maureen, please interrupt. We've done 3. Let me think.
Okay. Do you want to do one now, answer some questions, and hit another one?
Yeah, let's go with number 3, describing their efforts. And
okay, there we go. How would you describe your organization's DEI efforts?
And while they're answering that, Julius, one of the questions maybe you can answer is, maybe the changes we've been talking about are more knee-jerk reactions to the societal factors that have happened that you just mentioned, COVID and social unrest. Do you think that that's the case, that this is really just knee-jerk?
I don't. I think for many organizations, the process didn't just start, in August of 2020. I think that many organizations have for a number of years, and we talked about women's initiatives initially, starting back to women's initiatives over the last, 10, 15 years, have been wrestling with how their organizations can and should respond to the need to be a bit more diverse. And again, it was initially in the women's space, and has over the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, evolved more to a broader definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think you mentioned tipping point. I think the August timeframe of the summer activities, if you will, became a bit of a tipping point to not only force some organizations that hadn't been in the DEI space at all, and some that had been, sticking their toe in the water sort of thing, to increase their efforts. And so I think that has served that purpose of really accelerating the efforts of organizations across the board. And in particular, in the accounting space, I think all of that and the demographic drivers have continued to put some pressures on this, and will continue to put pressures in the space.
So Maureen, I think
go ahead and close it down in 3, 2, 1. Would you like me to share?
Sure. And Julius, you see that 25% of those responding say they're not sure. Does that get us all the way back to this top of the chain? Is the leadership responsible for those 25% that say they don't know? Should they be talking to their people in their organizations today saying, here's what we're doing, and here's why we're doing it?
Yeah, no question. And I will say that even in organizations that are doing something, in the individuals who didn't check not sure, I would argue that there's oftentimes a disconnect between what leaders believe they're doing within the organization and what the organization's rank and file folks believe is being done. And so I think organizations have to ask questions about, just to kind of summarize some of the things that we've talked about, how much transactional moving of the needle are you comfortable with, right? How much can your organization absorb? How much can the leadership as well as the rank and file absorb? How well is the level of transactional commitment? How well is it communicated to your employees, to your point? Many employees don't have a shared expectation or understanding of what it means that we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion effort within the organization. And so, oftentimes you'll hear, if you poll the rank and file team members, they hear, all right, we're doing diversity, equity, and inclusion. That means we're going to go from a 2 to a 7 in the next 6 to 12 months. When the organization really meant, we're going to go from a 2 to 4 over that same period of time. And so there's a disconnect between expectations that really needs to be better communicated, right?
So there's a question here. It says, I do not understand your fifth item at the beginning of the list. And I think the fifth item was hire the best person for the job. And if you look at that article, what they talk about is bringing in outside consultants and other people with specialized knowledge. You know, you talked at the beginning how you aren't a person who studied DEI. You were speaking from the perspective of your experiences as the other person or the only person in the room. I think having all of those voices are important. So I just wanted to acknowledge that comment. Thank you for sharing that. And there's another question, and I don't know that you can answer it, but it's been here for a minute. What are we doing to get more diversity in the employment field? And I'm hoping that is about people in the HR teams so that they can influence then our HR policy, our HR practices, our HR systems.
Well, so that's a great point. Oftentimes we'll see more diversity, if you will, in the administrative space, and than you will in the professional staff. And but you don't often see that in the key positions of HR director or recruiters that are going out into schools and other areas to recruit a more diverse talent. And so, you know, people are always more comfortable, by and large, with people that they share experiences or backgrounds with. And so it's no surprise that if you don't have more diversity in those spaces of people that are going out to mine the fields, if you will, then you won't see as much diversity in those that are coming to the organization. So I think it's an important point that question raises.
So there's another question here that says, you know, they're thanking us for talking about this. They said they speak for others that maybe they want to know this information, but they don't always know how to ask without offending. And so I think that speaks to the difficulty still we have of how to have uncomfortable conversations. But in the context of leadership, I don't know that we can always give our leaders feedback. You know, you talked about a disconnect between what the leaders think is success and what the rest of us think is success. How do you have that conversation? Can you tell your leader that, no, it's not like that here?
I think you can. They've got to want to hear it, but I think you can in a couple of different ways. It's certainly difficult to do that as an individual, but you know, many organizations have employee resource groups that can provide feedback from the rank and file, if you will, that isn't coming from an individual, right? It's coming from a group of individuals that have a vested interest in having that particular affinity move forward within the organization. And so that's one way of doing that. You know, certainly, as I mentioned earlier, having either HR or marketing or some arm of the organization, you know, doing cultural surveys within the organization helps to get to some of that. But I guess, it has to be something that they want to hear, and B, it's got to be something that they listen to and value when they actually get that.
So I'm looking at the time. We have probably 2 or 3 more minutes. So I'll share these questions more as comments. One is that there's a challenge in the education system in terms of quality of education. We do know there's a difference looking at the pipeline between those students who start college versus those students who finish college. We also know that there's an increase in the number of students. I think it's something like 34 or 40%. We talked about this with Herschel last week. Start at the go to community college before they go to the 4-year programs. So maybe this influences how we look and whether we leverage internships or apprenticeships in order to get those people to see the organizations that we work in and gain interest in our respective fields. In our case, we're talking about public accounting. Let me
And
see.
let me just say on that point that I know there are organizations, PICPA happens to be one of those, as well as AICPA. Many of the big four firms are really looking to put resources, financial resources into community college and other scholarships to help individuals that are underrepresented become more successful.
So I'm, in the interest of time, and I know we got to wrap up, I wanted to put up here the resources. Just as a reminder, everybody, when you download the handout, is a copy of the slide deck. And you have that article titles and the source, so you can look that up, as well as now you can see that right there in the front, more clients, more talent, more revenue. That's that white paper you were talking about, Julius?
It is. It is. And we're in the process of updating that. I think that's probably about 4 years old now. In its second iteration, we're about to do the third iteration to bring it up to speed.
There's also that great, it's on YouTube, but there's that town hall, and I don't know if you were moderating it, but there's the town hall that you can actually watch right there on the website. So you can watch that presentation.
Yeah, I did moderate that panel, and there's a lot of other great resources on there that I think will be helpful to people that are looking to, if they want to use some resources to move their organizations forward. It is a real, if you've got the question of, I want to do it, but how do I do it? There are a lot of those how-tos in that website.
Yeah, the website actually links to some third-party resources. And so I think, there were 5 questions for poll questions, but we can skip the 4th one because all we really needed was 3.
Absolutely. Only 3 are required for credit, and we've already launched a bonus 4th one.
So before we hand it back to you, Maureen, to wrap it up, I'll just say, Julius, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and insights with us today. We probably could talk about this indefinitely because there are a lot of things we need to think about. And there are a lot of conversations we need to have at the leadership level and about leadership responsibility in driving this change. So this is just a start to that conversation, and thank you for being here to have that with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
And the only thing I'll say then is if you'll join us next week, Kimberly Ellison Taylor will be joining us. She is the first African-American chair of the American Institute of CPAs, which is important. And she wrote an article that listed 12 steps that organizations can look to start a D&I strategy. We're going to talk a little bit about that next week. So I would invite all of you to join us then.
I'll certainly be there.
And with that, Maureen, it's back at you to close us out. Where'd she go?
I'm right here. Thank you very much. I was on mute. It's kind of funny that you're emphasizing Kimberly because she just happens to be who we are featuring as a Black accounting trailblazer on our website today. So there we go.
Yay.
Yay. So thank you very much for this discussion. People are saying this is wonderful, great session. We need more time. We need a repeat. This is an important topic. People are saying, are you available to train their company, Julius? So they like what you've done. We do want to thank all of you for being here today and for your questions and comments. We will be processing your CPE by the end of the day today, and that will be made available in your CPA Academy account within 24 hours, along with an archived recording of this webinar and a copy of the handouts. You should have already received now an email. Should be in your inbox waiting there for you for an evaluation of the webinar. Go ahead and please fill that out. And that link will also be available in your CPA Academy account. Well, thank you, everyone. We hope that you can continue this conversation offline, and we hope you join us for more webinars here at CPA Academy. Thank you so much again, Julius and Jina. Yes,
Maureen, can I just throw out that one thing? This contact slide, feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in having Julius, I'm sure, come in and help. You can certainly email me and I can pass that information along.
And the short answer is yes, Maureen, to that question. Thank you for that.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you again. And everyone have a great day. Bye-bye.
All right, that means we are off the air, yes?